Hi everyone, happy end of the second week of class, although technically it doesn't until Sunday because you have homework due then. This first video I'm sending out is going to cover the last 3 days of notes and just kind of touch on a few key points, and then I'm going to send a follow-up that explains your homework assignment due Sunday, which applies all the concepts that we've been discussing the last 2 weeks in terms of elements of narrative. So we have to cover setting, theme, and symbolism in this video. Unfortunately, we'll just start with setting, which is a pretty easy concept. A lot of times people think of setting as just the place in which a story occurs, but it's also the time in which a story occurs. So, for instance, if I say something happens in England, I've given you some details about the setting, but if I tell you it's Victorian England, you now have a much better idea of the cultural backdrop. And if I tighten it further and say it's Victorian London, it's the East End, you know, like now you've got a bit more, and you're going to be able to start inferring the kind of story that you're likely to read, the kind of cultural atmosphere that you're going to encounter. You know, so, think Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist, things like that. So it can also include, like this note here says, like, it can include the weather, it's a dark and stormy night. Well, you already know the setting is dark, stormy, and it's night, that's just a famously cliched sort of way to kick off a horror or mystery narrative. And the reason that we dwell on setting is that it can be a really important factor in the narrative. Sometimes, it's just a backdrop and we don't really pay a whole lot of attention to it. Other times it's intimately involved in what's happening in the narrative, and horror is a great genre to give that example. I've pulled a GIF here. If you've never seen Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining, which is a Stephen King novel, you should, because setting is everything in this text, and it dictates character action, it dictates response, it sets up foreshadowing, it establishes tone, and so it's just really quite important. You can't ignore the setting, that this family is in an isolated hotel up in the mountains, with a bunch of creepy we'll call them ghosts, in various hotel rooms, and they're very distinctly influencing the psychological health of the family. Without that setting, the story doesn't work, right? And in fact, that narrative started by Stephen King visiting a hotel, so setting generates the narrative. If I were to ask you later, what are the 3 major elements of setting, you should always be able to tell someone it's time, it's the place, and it's the social environment. And I've described social environment, giving you the example of like Charles Dickens and Victorian London. But that can change too, depending on what social class we're discussing. I gave you Oliver Twist, which is, of course, lower level, poor children, and, the infamous street urchin, right, narrative. But you can have highbrow versions of Victorian literature too, and that's going to be a totally different setting if they're like in a palace, So social environment's really, really key. The other thing is, just like we've said before, if an author spends any kind of time describing the environment, they want you to pay attention to it. They don't linger on it because it's fun. They're trying to key you to something. And we're going to talk about the yellow wallpaper later, but that is a setting that is so important, that she's basically imprisoned in this room with this hideous yellow wallpaper. So it's important that the author lingers there. Just like Story of an Hour, she goes upstairs to look out the window. Well, the fact that she moves up and she's kind of elated and she thinks she's free of this kind of life she thought she was going to have to live, and then she comes physically down right when she has her psychological demise, when she realizes, oh no, she's really actually still trapped in that life. So the up-down is actually pretty important. And of course Bartleby, where he's on Wall Street, which the name of the street is Wall Street, you know, so really quite important. And so, you know, like I say here, you really can't extract setting from narrative. It sets the stage, I mean, literally, right? Like, it is the stage upon which characters perform, and in various narratives it plays more or less of a role. So I think that's enough about setting. Let's look at theme. Theme is interesting in that people actually sometimes really struggle to articulate the theme. I think we as readers these days are savvier than we realize. We typically intuit, you know, when we read a narrative, we know what we think the author, or in this case, we see gifts, directors are trying to tell us. But when we're asked to say what the theme is, we can struggle, and a lot of times people will describe the subject to you versus the theme. And the theme is really the message of the narrative, right? It's not the subject, which can be interpreted as the topic. So I'll give you a quick example right here. If you've never seen Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, I think you can, from the skip alone, understand both the subject and the theme, which this movie was generated during World War II. He is supposed to be imitating Adolf Hitler, and he is a clown, right? He is playing with the world, literally bouncing it off his butt. The subject is a dictator. The theme is the way in which, you know, ego drives this callous disregard for the rest of the world, and it's just a toy, right? So that's the difference between subject and theme. Subject is just a topic. The theme is what is being said about that topic. And, you know, here you see in the notes and in the text, it tells us this is the unifying point. All the setting and the symbolism and the plot structure and the characterization all drive us to interpret the theme, you know. So those are really important in narration, like how that's told to us as well. And sometimes theme is implicit, and sometimes it is very explicit. Like it will outline it for you, right? So I think of something like, I don't know, Animal Farm, you know, if you've ever read that, where the animals take over the farm and try to create an egalitarian society, but in the end, it doesn't work out, right? All animals are created equal, except some animals are more equal than others, and that's a pretty explicit theme, like this idea that humans are animals who cannot create egalitarian society. They can't create utopias. And, you know, a text may have more than one theme. We're looking at short stories, so, you know, you maybe aren't going to find, like, a ton of different messages being tossed at you. But, you know, you watch or read a long series of novels, you're going to encounter a number of themes. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, there's a plethora of themes running through that narrative, and each character is kind of pursuing a different agenda and a different take, and they represent a different, you know, theme. And so, you know, we're going to try not to really nerd out on you or anything there, don't worry. But really, in the end, it's one theme, which is what makes a good leader, right? Like, you can debate me on that, but don't. But it is, at its heart, it's a storyline about what is good leadership and what is good government, and how do we determine that. And, you know, we follow different people that we're empathetic with who do take variations on those themes, but we see leadership at different kind of levels, at the global and in the personal, and so you can see different takes. And of course, another theme is, you know, what's the value of family within a world of strife, and what's the value of personal valor in a world that doesn't value that, you know, so on. So that's why I say, you know, you can find multiple themes in a text. You know, I kind of touched on subjects, but again, subjects are topics. Like, what is the literal story subject? You know, with the Charlie Chaplin example, it's dictatorship, it's leadership. you know, and others like thinking, you know, Snow White, that's youth versus age, you know, beauty versus power, you know, things like that, right? But it's saying something about it. It's, you know, it's got its own take on that, depending on which version of Snow White you read. I recommend Neil Gaiman's Snow Glass Apples if you've never read it, in which Snow White is pretty much a vampire, and it's kind of great. And keeping an eye on time with this recording. And, you know, like I said before, there's a number of ways to start figuring out what the theme is. If it seems like a mystery to you, you can always look at the title. You can always spend time looking for specific details, especially if they've been repeated. If something is repeated in a narrative, particularly a short story, it means the author thinks it's important and they want you to remember it. And then always pay attention to the kind of sweeping generalizations a narrator makes, because these are judgments. And then try to make, you know, you've just heard me toss out some pretty loose, generalized statements about what massive texts are about. I said, you know, Game of Thrones is about leadership, you know. Do that kind of work for yourself. Like, try to write out in a sentence or two what you think that story's really trying to say. And avoid cliches like love conquers all. Like, really, you know, I don't think Romeo and Juliet's about love conquers all. It's definitely about youth and love and emotion and family, but it's not about that. You know, so try to avoid cliches, because I would tell you, good literature, which is subjective, rarely gives us a message that's clean and easy to sum up like that. Okay. Try to move through it, because I get 15 minutes at a crack for screencasting. So finally we have symbolism, which is honestly one of my favorite things, just because it's fun to see what people do with it and how they play with images and topics. And of course, it's one of the things that literary scholars get knocked for. I think I put a joke in here in one of the agendas where they're like, what the author says about the blue curtains versus what your English professor says blue curtains mean. You know, there's no meeting point between them. But the truth is, authors use symbolism all the time, right? It's important because it's a nice, quick shortcut to give you meaning that might otherwise not be there, right? So it's where you have this person, object, or event that's more than just its surface meaning. It's literal meaning, right? And again, you want to look for repetition, because symbols are typically reinforced throughout. And, you know, again, here you see me, I'm grabbing from Batman Begins, which you may not remember back in the day, Chris Nolan, the first Batman Begins in his series. You know, Bruce Wayne says he wants to be incorruptible. He wants to be something that's everlasting. So he chooses a symbol, right, which is the bat. You know, as a man, he could be destroyed, but other people can become Batman, which is, I don't want to ruin it for you, how the third one in the Nolan series ends is someone else takes up the mantle, because it doesn't have to be one man, it could be anybody. And if you watched Into the Spider-Verse recently, that's the same message, right? Like, heroes come in different shapes and sizes. It just happens that the symbol in that case is Spider-Man, not Batman. Anywho. And there's different types of symbols, right? We have conventional symbols, which we recognize and a lot of times are used for logos and you know, kind of capitalistic endeavors. So here you have a quick logo, which if you look at it, you realize it's not accurate, but you know it's evoking Levi's because it's burned into our brain. This means jeans, right? Even though you and I don't see a pair of jeans here. And what it's really mimicking is the back pockets, the original cut of the back pockets, right? But we also have this hierarchy of symbols. Oh man, I'm running out of time. So like knockoffs will do something like this, and that means it's less good, right? But in our case, what we're really interested in is the literary symbol, which means that it has to work within the total context of the narrative. It has to support the narrative. The wallpaper is really important. If she didn't have the wallpaper to contemplate it, the story would not be the same, but it reflects her interior emotions. It is the interior of the room, and thus the two are connected. So it must have more than one meaning to be a symbol that is so important. It can't just be wallpaper. It has to mean something more. It represents psychology. and I'm about to be cut off. So look for one more video on your home.